Good evening. I know it sounds weird, but Chaps Fantasy Chat on a Thursday night. Or excuse me. See, I can't even get it right. On a Wednesday night. It's interesting. Thanksgiving, it's a tradition that there's NFL football on Thanksgiving Day. It's a great tradition. It's one that we all celebrate. It is always fun to watch the Lions and the Cowboys, and then have in the recent years we've had a third game added in, and that's always been an intriguing game, a game that's supposed to be highly anticipated. So we have 3 games this week on Thursday night. So I decided to come on air a little bit early and share with you guys my thoughts on how we're going to take advantage, not only on a Thursday slate, right, for DFS, but also we're going to talk about general DFS guys to pick on, teams to pick on, right? We're going to use, as we always do, we're going to do it a little differently tonight, but we usually go through and we talk about statistics. We talk about what these, especially as we get later in the year, we have data points that we can gather from. We know what teams are, right? And it shows when we look at these team defenses. Now, tonight I'm going to introduce something a little bit different from what I've been talking about. We're going to talk about some short-term metrics. We're going to incorporate that into how we attack these games this weekend. So, again, this is Chaps Fantasy Chat. For those of you that might be tuning in for Draft for Upside, Mark Lawson and Jonathan Cole were gracious enough to, I guess this is the normal spot. I did not realize that. They were not on the schedule, but I do very much appreciate them. So I will be going for an hour. They will come on directly after me. So please, if you're hanging out there, please stick around for Draft for Upside at 8:00, and we will. They will continue what I've started. I'm quite sure of it, and they're also going to talk some more about DFS, and they're going to talk about how you can make successful entries. And I was talking to Jonathan before this, and he said that he too was going to talk about good whiskey. So I'll take this. I'll take a moment. You guys see, I'm drinking Russell's Reserve tonight. I just want to give a quick shout out to my cousin Patrick. He works up at Citywide Liquor up in South Bend, and he is a whiskey connoisseur. So I am very lucky to have Russell's Reserve tonight. It is quite tasty. I am actually on my second glass, and this is meant to be enjoyable, right? So I'm going to have a drink and enjoy it. So, Arnie, thanks for joining. My sidekick, my compadre, my homie, my brother from another mother. It's good to see you're on here. I love getting interaction with you. But I'm not giggling at you. Team defense, we are going to, we've talked about Carolina and team in weeks past. We will talk about the Eagles. And, it's interesting, right? Because we are talking about short-term memory here, okay? When we start doing these, when we start going down through here, we want to start, as we get now going into our 12th game, you want to put the short-sighted blinders on, because some of these teams have improved. Some of these teams have gotten healthy. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, Arn. So first off, I want to start out, I've talked about this ad nauseum. I think it's important to talk about it again. The Arizona Cardinals stink at covering the tight end position. I know you guys that hear me often are probably sick about hearing it. But here's the stats, Jack. 12 touchdowns in 11 games. 846 yards and 70 receptions to the tight end position alone. That equals out to 14.2 fantasy points per game that the Arizona Cardinals are giving up to the tight end position. So every week, if you're talking about DFS, if you're in a pickle at tight end, you want to go out and you want to see who Arizona's playing. Okay? Now, I'll take this a step back. Let's talk about the guys right behind them because there's not equally, but because the next four you can also target, okay? Tampa Bay's next. They're giving up 11 fantasy points a game to the tight end position. Green Bay is third, giving up 10. Oakland is fourth, 9.6, and Seattle's fifth at 9.3. So anytime any of these teams are playing a tight end, you got to queue them up, okay? If they're on your league, if you're playing a DFS, however you're looking at it, okay? But let's be clear. There's two teams we're talking about here. There's two teams that I want you to pay close attention to. Arizona and Tampa Bay. Arizona right now, Tampa Bay we'll talking about in a little bit. Again, Tampa Bay's second, giving up 11 fantasy points per game to the position. They've given up the third most touchdowns to tight ends with 7. But let's talk about Arizona. 12 touchdowns in 11 games. First off, I want to take a pivot here. It is Thanksgiving. I won't dwell on this reflective crap. I don't believe in it. But I do want to take a second and pay homage, pay tribute to family. I'm very thankful to have my mother and my sister at home. I actually have my mother-in-law with us tonight. Just want to say a shout out to Margie. She's been one of my biggest supporters throughout this whole process. So, I just want you guys to know that I do this because I love it, right? I'm making time out of my schedule. And that's great because it's a part of me. Caleb's my nephew. He knows this is what I love to do, right? So thanks for sharing this with me on this holiday weekend. So let's talk about Arizona. Let's talk about they're playing the Rams this week, okay? And we'll get into the Thursday games. I'll do a good bit on them here in a little bit. But I want to take a second and look at this from an overview perspective and talk about 4 or 5 teams here that we can take advantage of players. Okay? So we're talking about the Arizona Cardinals, who are giving up a touchdown plus a game to the position. And we're talking about Gerald Everett, and we're talking about Tyler Higbee. Okay? Now, here's the issue. Both of those guys are involved. Everett was a higher draft pick. Higbee seems to be the perpetual pain in the backside because he keeps getting targets. Now, when you look at these two guys, so first off, let's take a step back. You look at the Rams this year. They've struggled in the pass game. They have had issues. They've not been the greatest show on turf like they were supposed to be. They were not supposed to be, or they have not been, Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks and Cooper Kupp and just unstoppable, right? They've had to find other ways to do it, and they haven't been that successful. But what they've done is include the tight end position a lot more this year, okay? Now, we haven't seen the results yet. And this is why it's important to understand sometimes that's a good thing, right? Sometimes that means they're due. I'm going to go out on a limb here. If you're playing a DFS, hell, if you need a tight end, if you're streaming tight ends, Tyler Higbee is not a bad shot here. In the last 2 weeks, he's got 6 targets. He's caught 5 of them for only 20 yards, but he's been involved. Okay? We're talking about, he's been playing teams like the Steelers and the Ravens. It's not been pretty, the teams he's playing. He's playing the Cardinals this week. It's a little different. I think both of these guys score. They really have kind of focused on the tight end position this year, and I think it's important to take note that both of these guys are viable DFS options. So, again, I really think when you look at the statistics and you look at how big a chunks of yardage, how many touchdowns Tampa Bay has given up to the tight end position, Higbee and Everett are both solid options here. If you're going DFS and you want to go in a tournament, I'd go Everett, but if you're really needing the price break, Higbee is a solid play. Okay? Let's move on. I want to move to my next point because this is something I've missed to this point of the year. I told you guys who the number two pass defense. I'm talking about for this week, Jonathan. I'm talking about for this week, and it's based off of the fact that Arizona has been so bad against the tight end position. You have to take advantage of it. Okay? That's the perspective I'm coming from. You look at the statistics. The team statistics versus tight end. They're giving up 3 more points a game, fantasy points a game, than Tampa Bay is sitting at second. That's a pretty big number. It doesn't matter. That's why they're doing dink and dunk. And again, they're not playing the Steelers, and they're not playing the Ravens. They're playing the Cardinals. Okay? So, let's move on. For sake of time. But I love the challenge. I think you're right. I mean, Goff stinks. I'm not saying he doesn't. But that's why they're going to the tight ends rather than the receivers, right? Let's talk about Tampa Bay because I really want to drive this point home. I've missed this. I apologize to you guys for missing this. Tampa Bay, again, the second worst team versus the tight end in the pass, is the worst team now versus the receivers position. And they've got a 4-point lead on the second place Giants. They've given up a league high 2,267 passing yards. And they're tied with the Dolphins with 18 touchdowns through the air. Pick on them. Pick on them. Right? I mean, if you need him for this week, Arnie, you absolutely have Higbee. I mean, I don't know what you're dealing with, but there's no... That's why you do this. That's why you do it. If you're struggling at tight end this week, or if you need a flex, if you're throwing out, I can't remember who you told me, why not take a chance on Higbee? It's 50-50 he scores. Someone's scoring for the Rams. I almost said St. Louis. I love DD. I love Shark too, but we'll get to that in a little bit, right? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Tampa Bay and Jacksonville. Yes, you're right. Jonathan. DD is the man. DJ Shark is the man. Okay? But before we get to that, this week. This week. I like Foles. I like this offense. Okay? But this week, let's be clear. So again, we're going to talk about short-term memory here. Let's talk about the last quarter, the last 4 games. Just because we want to do a sanity check. You'll see why we do this in a minute. Okay? The last 4 games, Tampa Bay. 326, 0 touchdowns and interception in Atlanta. 228, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions versus the Saints. 350, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, Atlanta. 378, 5 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions against Seattle. So you look at the last 4 games, the last quarter, as I like to call it. 3 out of 4 games have been 300-yard passers. They've given up multiple touchdowns in 3 of those games. This is a trend. You can feel confident starting Jacksonville's receivers. Hell, any of them. Anybody against this defense. Jonathan, you're right. I do like DD. I chose to feature Shark, so I look forward to your DD commentary in about 47 minutes. Shark has become a consistent wide receiver 1. Right? You look at what he's done with both Gardner Minshew and Nick Foles now. Here's the thing. Fun fact. He's 5th among all receivers in fantasy points per game in PPR format. 191.4. 5th. Bet you wouldn't have guessed that unless you're a nerd, which I know I'm looking at 3 nerds in here now. 4 nerds in here now. I love Shark this week, but you're absolutely right, Danger. Didi's an equally viable option here this week. But the one I want to talk about, the one that slips through the cracks, if you will. How about Chris Conley? Pause for dramatic effect. Here's the thing about Conley. I mean, yeah, he's not set the world on fire. But he has been a consistent factor. He has averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game this season. So he scored 11 points in 3 of his last 5 games. Again, we're talking about the worst pass defense in the league. And it's not close. If you're in a pickle, Arnie, look at Chris Conley. You could do worse than Chris Conley. He offers you a safe floor. Kevin, aloha. Thanks for joining. Just saying, that's why we do this, okay? So, again, Chappy suggests DJ Shark from this game. But if you need a pivot, if you need cash relief in a DFS format, if you're in a pickle, if you want to be contrarian, go Chris Conley. Of course he's not available. Frickin' 14-team leagues. So, to close the loop on this first segment, right? We're 16 minutes in. You're listening to Chap's Fantasy Chat on the Lenny Melnick Fantasy Sports Network. I got all my friends with me tonight, so I'm feeling no pain. Let's put it that way. I'm drinking Russell's Reserve. We're talking fantasy football. How could it be bad, right? But to wrap this up, let's talk about Arizona versus the tight end. But for emphasis, Tampa Bay passing in general. Okay, it's really important. It's really important that you understand where to pick on these statistics. Okay, where to look at, and you know, a lot of this stuff, you miss some of this stuff, right? So Tampa Bay, again, they're 4 points worse through the air than the second place New York Giants. 18 touchdowns is tied for the league worst with the Miami Dolphins. 2,267 yards is the league worst. That's why we're talking about these guys, okay? It's just important to understand the why, right? So let's move on. Let's talk about the Giants. The second worst pass defense, right? They play the Packers this week. And here's the thing. Everybody kind of, and the Packers are doing well. The Packers are 8-3, right? But let's look at some short-term optics here. The last 4 weeks, the Giants. You tell me if you could take advantage of this team. Last 4 weeks, the Bears, 278 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Passing. The Jets, 230 yards, a touchdown, and 0 interception. Dallas, 257, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. And Detroit, 342, 3 TDs, and an interception. For me, let me clarify, 300 yards is the bar, right? 300 yards passing is the bar. That's just how I feel about it. This team's not been bad, right? really do think when you look at the short-term optics here, it doesn't make sense to target Green Bay Packers this week because, not so much because the optics are bad from the pass defensive perspective. It's more about when you start to look at, Arnie, I'm going to answer your question. I promise I am. And I'm getting there. When you look at the Packers pass offense, it's been kind of a letdown. And I say kind of quite generously, right? So let's look at it. On the year, okay, you have Davante Adams leads the team with 580 yards, which sounds great when you listen to the rest of these guys, but we're talking about, we're in the third month. This is game 12. 580 yards is not what you drafted Davante Adams at 1.5 for, right? I mean, that's kind of a letdown. Marquez Valdez-Scantling is second with 427 yards. Aaron Jones is third with 354 yards. Graham is fourth with 317, and Lazard is fifth with 227 yards. Now, the most disappointing piece to all of this, in my opinion, the most disappointing piece to all of this, in my opinion, is Davante Adams is the flippin' leader of this team, and he's played a third less games. And the other frustrating piece to that is no Green Bay wide receiver has scored more than 2 touchdowns. So I say this, why it's important to have short-term optics on this is, okay, I can get on board with the Davante Adams positive regression is coming. I love Buffalo Trace, Jonathan. That's a great liquor. Actually, when I went to the store to buy this Russell's Reserve, I was going looking for Eagle Rare, but they didn't have it. I guess they sold out. Unfortunately, but Buffalo Trace is delicious. So cheers. I will take a drink and pay salute. But then I quickly want to get back to point. If you're looking at anybody here, you got 2 options, in my opinion. Arnie, you're in a pickle. If you want to take someone here, I'm of the opinion to take Scantling. But you do it grinding your teeth. Because it's not terribly promising. If I'm coming from a DFS perspective, am looking at Davante Adams and looking at his 1 stinking touchdown and thinking that's going to correct itself. It's a law of averages, right? It's a positive swing, okay? So if you look at all of these guys, to me, Davante Adams is getting ready to return to form, right? And yes, Lenny, just want to take a second. Draft for Upside is up next at 8 p.m. Jonathan and Mark, I want to send my sincerest appreciation for setting aside this hour for me to kind of come on here and rant about a few of these games. Mark and Jonathan are going to talk about DFS just like I'm talking about, so it'll be a nice transition. They're going to talk about whiskey, which is what I'm talking about, so it'll be a nice transition, right? This is fun. It's a holiday week. I don't have to flip and work tomorrow. So let's have some fun talking about this, right? So, I'm not sold yet, Arnie, on Marquez Valdez-Scantling, but he's an option, okay? So let's talk about this. Let's talk about another team. And we're putting our short-term blinders on again here. Let's talk about the Eagles. Again, they're 4th on this list. I'm skipping the 3rd place team because I want to talk about them a little bit. But the Eagles are one of those things where if you look at the last 4 games, they're pretty friggin' dominant. So let's talk about it. The last quarter, Russell Wilson, pretty damn good quarterback. 200 yards, a touchdown and interception. Tom Brady, 231 yards, a touchdown and no interceptions. Chicago, 125 yards, 0-0. And Buffalo, 169 yards, 2 touchdowns and interception. So even though Philadelphia is the 4th worst fantasy point team versus the wide receivers, if you put your short-term blinders on, it shows a very different picture. And in Philadelphia's case, you can point directly to the fact that they're getting healthy, right? And their starters have come back. They play Miami this week. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I wanted to point to this as an example of why you need to look at different perspectives, right? So the last team I want to talk about in terms of looking at team statistics, and then we're going to do the Thursday games, and then we're going to move into as many as the Sunday games as I can get to, okay? But I think it's important to take notice of this is a Thursday game. That's why it's a natural lead-in. The New Orleans Saints and the Atlanta Falcons. If you look at the Atlanta Falcons, they're 3rd on this list versus wide receiving. They're giving up 26.8 fantasy points per game to the position. 14 touchdowns and 2,118 yards. Does not bode well. It does not look good. But there's a few factors going on here that you must take into account. Before I get into the one I've been talking about, I do want you to take in mind, this is a rematch from a game just 2 weeks ago. Atlanta kicked their ass. Talking about the Saints. In New Orleans. This is a division game. These teams are very familiar, right? So, we want to keep that in mind when we're really talking about targeting this game, okay? So let's talk about the game. The Saints are a 7-point favorite against the Falcons. Again, last time out, the Falcons held Alvin Kamara to 24 rushing yards. 74 total. New Orleans didn't score. 26-9. Thomas had 152 yards, but he didn't get in the end zone. Okay? These are things we want to think about. It plays a factor because you look at it initially and you think this is a juicy matchup. But then when you look at a couple of these peripheries, it looks very different, right? So, let's talk about Atlanta's pass defense over the last 4 games. Because that adds another layer of complexity. I screwed this up. That's all right. One of these teams. So 312 yards, 3 TDs, and 2 interceptions. I know they didn't play Atlanta. They didn't play themselves. But that's one of the games. So apologies. If you guys want to look that up, hook a brother up. That'd be cool. But I'll move on because it's not a big deal. We're building a case here. We're talking about, overview of the last quarter. The team's marginally important. 313 yards, 3 TDs, and 2 INTs. The next game, Carolina, 325 yards, 0 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Again, we're measuring this, right, to see how Atlanta's pass defense is done in a short-term sample so we can determine whether or not we want to use it. 325, 0 TDs, and 4 INTs. 304, that's versus Carolina. 304 yards, 0 TDs, 0 interceptions. Against the Saints, 0 TDs, 0 interceptions. And then 182 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception versus Seattle. There's a lot of things going on here, right, guys? You got a fresh set of data points because they just played each other 2 or 3 weeks ago. 304 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Let's think back to that. New Orleans was a heavy favorite in that game, just like they are in this game. Atlanta had won 1 game coming into that game. Atlanta dominated them. They did not get into the end zone. Against the team that everybody thought at that point was a strong consideration for the NFC representative in the Super Bowl. I can't say it's changed much, right? But fact of the matter is, if anything, Atlanta's at home now. It should be easier. I'm not foolish. I don't think it is. I still think New Orleans is the favorite. But it wouldn't surprise me if Atlanta came out and played a game. So, let's talk about the most logical DFS play of the century. Michael Thomas, you got to play him every week, right? He leads the NFL in targets by 12, which is a pretty large margin, right? 124 to 112. Receptions, he leads in receptions by 23. He's got 104 receptions already. The next closest is 81. He leads in yards by well over 100. 1242 to 1071. And yards per game, he leads 112.9 to 97.4. He's clearly wide receiver 1-1. It's not close, okay? He's averaging 22 fantasy points a game over his last 5 games. Michael Thomas is a no-brainer this matchup. All right? But I will say, I like Calvin Ridley here too. Because Atlanta's going to pass a lot. And New Orleans' pass defense is marginal. Lenny, I don't believe that. So, this is another thing. We've talked about this in weeks past, where if New Orleans comes out of the gate and they score a lot, Atlanta's going to have to score with them to keep up, right? So they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. I think Matt Ryan's a sneaky play. I love Calvin Ridley. Atlanta's really beat up. They're going to have to get Ridley involved. So, again, based off of the data, this seems like Michael Thomas is a no-brainer here, worth the money. I'm also going to say, take a chance on Ridley. You might want to team the two up. It might be a good way to look at it. So, speaking of Turkey Day football, I'm not going to do the I give thanks crap. But what I do want to do is I want to make sure we're looking at 27 minutes and then you're looking at draft for upside. I think Ridley's a good play here. Welcome, Futznuckin. And I'm on my second glass of Russell's Reserve. Apparently Lenny's faded with me. But you know what? This isn't my first rodeo. 2 glasses of whiskey on the rocks isn't going to affect what I bring to you in terms of these games. We got a lot of really great stuff. I hope you enjoy. So let's talk about, here we are, we're 30 minutes in. I don't think that's too bad, right? Let's talk about Thursday football. There's 3 games this week on Thursday. They're not the best games. Is that Andy typing for you, Lenny? But you know what? You can take real advantage of some of these games if you just take a second and understand what we're looking at, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about, let's talk about the first game. We're talking about the Bears and we're talking about the Lions. It's important to take note. Detroit is the second worst defense versus running backs in the NFL. We've talked about Kansas City. Detroit, we have not talked about that much. 24.3 yards per game, fantasy points per game is significant. $1,093 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns. Little less than a touchdown a game given up on the ground. They've given up 157.4 total yards to the position and are averaging a touchdown and a half per game, including receiving, to the position. Look, I know David Montgomery has been up and down. But when we just look at facts, he's the 24th best running back in the NFL. He has struggled lately. He hasn't found double digits in 3 of his last 4 games. But prior to that, he had 2 20-point plus nights. And I think the potential's here for him to get right. This is a get right game for David Montgomery. I'm trying to tell you guys, as we go through these matchups, if you're looking at DFS, if you're looking at your season long, you don't know whether to start David Montgomery or Tevin Coleman. This is the determining factor. You look at these statistics. This week, I'm telling you to start David Montgomery because the defense he's playing likes to give up huge amounts of yards. I'm not uber confident in Montgomery. I don't want to mince words here. But if you're looking purely at statistics, and you have a fringe player, this is someone I'm willing to take a risk on this week. Okay? That's where I'm coming from with this. Allen Robinson has been up and down, just like much of the Bears team. 53 targets over his past 6 weeks. He's only catching 60.6% of the balls thrown his way. 387 yards. He's averaging 64.5 per game. He's only scored twice over the last 6 weeks. If you're in a pickle, you might want to look at him. This could be some regression coming back the positive way. He has struggled. It looks like Trubisky is starting to trend in a positive direction again. But here's the thing. The Lions' pass defense isn't good. So last week, the Lions held Dwayne Haskins to no touchdowns. They held him outside of the QB1, right? Your top 12 QBs. First off, Haskins stinks. We all know that, right? But second off, that was just the second time all year. I'll reword that. The Lions have given up a top 12 quarterback statistic to every quarterback this year except for Dwayne, I stink Haskins. Trubisky has 6 touchdowns in his last 2 starts against the Lions. So maybe it's time to look at Allen Robinson. That's why you look at these stats. Okay? Let's talk about 4:30. Let's talk about the Bills. Let's talk about the Cowboys. It's interesting to me. The Bills are 8-3. The Cowboys are 6-5. Yet the Cowboys are 6.5-point favorites. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But then you talk about, I don't understand why the Cowboys are getting basically a touchdown. Giving a touchdown, excuse me. If anything, you would think the Bills would be favored here, right? But let's look at the logistics here. The Bills have allowed just 7 passing touchdowns all year. We've played 11 games, guys. They've allowed multiple touchdowns once. That's a pretty impressive statistic. So, Jason, I know you might be listening. We talked about Dak Prescott this week. That's something you probably want to take into account. It doesn't bode well. Now, you can look at it one of two ways. Maybe there's some regression coming. Or maybe this is a huge opportunity for Zeke Elliott. Before we get to Zeke, though, I just want to drive home the point. 7 passing touchdowns the Bills have given up. They've given up 8 rushing touchdowns. They've given up 15 touchdowns on the season as a defense. Not too shabby, right? So, let's talk about Zeke here. I think it's really important to understand. So first off, fun fact, Zeke is averaging 25.7 fantasy points per game on Thanksgiving. So he's done well in this format. He's seen 18 touches in his last 6 games, and he's seen 22 touches in 5 of them. He currently sits at 8th among all fantasy running backs at 193.9 points. But I'll say this. I think that you're getting ready to see an uptick in Zeke Elliott and his usage over this last stretch. Tomorrow if you want to win your lineup, you got to start with Zeke Elliott. If you want to win at DFS tomorrow, you got to start with Mike Thomas and you got to start with Zeke Elliott. All of the other stuff, you could fill in. But those are the 2 guys, if we're looking at a Thursday slate, that must be in there. Okay? Couple fun facts. Michael Gallup, he's now seen 6 targets plus in 8 of 9 games this year. He's seen double-digit targets in 3 of them. So the Bills will probably shadow Cooper with Tre'Davious White. If that happens, look at Levi Wallace against Gallup. Wallace has allowed 69% completion rate and has allowed a touchdown once every 17 targets in man-to-man coverage. This is someone who's a good play tomorrow. He's a sneaky play, right? I got about 15 minutes. I want to talk about some of these games on Sunday. Please hang around. Listen to my friends Mark and Jonathan, Draft for Upsides at 8 o'clock. You're listening to Chaps Fantasy Chat on the Lenny Melnick Fantasy Sports Network. I'm going to be taking a couple weeks off. It's kind of crazy looking around this house. We're packing up and getting ready to move. But I really, I miss doing this, so I'll be itching to get back. I'm going to do baseball when I come back. So, Lenny, Andrea, I know you're excited about that. But let's talk about, Andrea, I'm glad you joined in. Let's talk about some of these Sunday games. Okay? If you got questions, let me know. I got 15 minutes. I want to start in Cleveland. And I want to start by saying, after my last show, I'm not going to comment on the Browns and the Steelers. I was totally off. But no, you know I'm going to comment about the Browns and the Steelers. Come on. I think there's some interesting things to take from this. I'm not going to go into what happened last time. Tyler Lockett. Caleb. Tyler Lockett is due for positive regression in the fact that he's still catching 81% of the balls thrown to him. Now, Seattle has gone away from the pass in the past month, but last week was an anomaly. Traditionally, on weeks where he doesn't get targeted, he gets targeted heavily the next week. I think it was week 2, he got targeted 3 times. Week 3, they targeted him 12th. I look for a big game out of Jarvis Landry this week. So let's talk about the Steelers. Let's talk about the Browns. This is a big game, right? What's going on there? Can you say duck, duck, goose? Kind of surprising. Devlin Hodges named Steelers starting quarterback. Initially, a negative for me. I'm not a big believer in knee-jerk reactions, but watching this team over the last month, it's become painfully evident that it's time. And Hodges has done a good job. No, he doesn't. Play Beckham. Andrea, play Beckham. Play him. Play Beckham. We'll get to it in a minute. I really do believe, as a coach's son, you have to find out what you have. And I think Mason Rudolph has given you enough of a sample size to prove to you that he is not it. He is not Ben's replacement. He is not anything other than a placeholder. I don't know if Devlin Hodges is it. I just know that when he's been in there, he's been a ton more effective. So, while I'm not always a big fan of bringing in an undrafted free agent to start, this seems like the right time to do it. The problem with that is there's not a whole lot of talent around Duck. Yes, James Washington has stepped up in the last couple games. He needs to show me consistency. Juju's still questionable. I can't tell you what Deontay Johnson's status is, but it seems like they are trending in the wrong direction. On point, Andrea. Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham were both factors last time. 8 receptions, 103 yards, and a touchdown combined. I know that doesn't sound great, but they're trending in the right direction. They'll need to do that again this week because the Pittsburgh run defense has been stout. Cleveland is quietly assembled with Kareem Hunt in the last couple weeks, a really potent offense. In fact, Nick Chubb, the forgotten man in that offense, is one of only 2 backs to average 100 yards a game on the season. McCaffrey at 101.5. Excuse me. McCaffrey has 102.1. Chubb has 101.5 right behind him. The next closest back is Dalvin Cook, all the way down at 92.5 yards per game. That's a significant difference. Nick Chubb is a big part of that offense. But the Steeler defense, run-wise, is pretty stout. This should be a game of strength on strength on both ends. Pittsburgh really does need Duck to step up and play like a veteran. I think he'll do that. But look for Beckham, look for Landry, look for Chubb, and look for Hunt, all to have big games. I know that means a lot of points, right? I think this is high scoring. That's why I say Hodges is a big deal. I don't know where Pittsburgh's offenses come from, quite honestly. But I know Hodges will move the ball. That's my point. Make sense? Let's move on. I'm not going to predict that game because last time I predicted it didn't freaking work out. Let's talk about the Jets and let's talk about the Bengals. Let's talk about the Jets. Arnie and I, way back in September, talked about Sam Darnold. And you know what? We looked like freaking fools for about 2/3 of the season. But all of a sudden, here's Mr. Big Head. Last 4 weeks, 1,098 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Guys, this guy's a second half performer. And it just so happens, he gets put into one hell of a scenario this week against the Bengals. This is a team, you look at what Darnold's done, he's gotten better. You have to remember, he had mononucleosis. I'm sorry, but when you come back from mono, you can't expect the dude to be 100% right out of the gate. And all the I'm seeing ghost shit couldn't have helped, right? It didn't help. Here's another positive about what I like about Sam Darnold this week. On the opposite end, the Bengals named Andy Dalton the starter this week. And we all know Andy Dalton isn't much. But what Andy Dalton is competent. Ryan Finley wasn't competent. You know Dalton's going to move the ball. So you want them to score just enough to keep pace. And I think you get that. I think you get that with Dalton. So that means to me, here's the question. Does Joe Mixon's numbers go down because Andy Dalton gets put back into the starting lineup? You think about the dynamic. Ryan Finley, a rookie quarterback's in there. Mixon is leaned on. He scored 17 plus points in his last 3 games. He scored in 2 of them. But is that because Finley was so bad? Do you see negative regression coming from him? I don't trust him. Couple fun stats. We got 8 minutes. Ryan Griffin, the 10th best catch percentage in the NFL. 84.8%. There's a name for you, Arnie. In your 14-team league. Go look at Ryan Griffin. He's played a large part in the Darnold resurgence. His numbers are modest. 28 receptions, 280 yards. But he's got 5 touchdowns. He scored double-digit fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. 20 points in 2 of them. Darnold, 21 plus points in his last 3 games. I look for that to continue. You're listening to Chat's Fantasy Chat. I normally come to you on Thursdays or Tuesdays, depending on the season. Tonight it's Wednesday, Happy Thanksgiving to all my friends. I really have enjoyed this last hour. I'm really excited to watch the Mountaineer basketball team compete in the championship of the Cancun Classic versus the Wichita State Shockers tonight. They survived this scrappy Northern Iowa team last night, and if you haven't checked out the Mountaineers, I highly suggest it. Chaps Fantasy Chat is a football and baseball broadcast network brought to you on the Lenny Melnick Fantasy Sports Network. I love what I do. I love the people I work with. My main man, Arnie, Lenny, Caleb, my nephew, thank you so much. Ed, Kevin, Drive for Upside, thank you so much for letting me have this hour. Give a listen to Draft for Upside coming up directly after me. Again, I am thankful to have this group of people in my life. That is what I'm thankful for this Thanksgiving. My family, my wife, and my mother, my sister, and my mother-in-law. I really have appreciated this past year. We're moving into a new place. As I've said, I'm going to be taking the next couple weeks off. I'm thankful to be moving into a new beautiful place. I'm thankful for the time that I've had this place. I love football. I plan on watching a bunch of games this weekend. I hope you all enjoy it as well. When I come back in a couple weeks, I will be talking baseball. There are big things coming up at Lenny Melnick Fantasy Sports Network. I plan to be part of them, and I'm appreciative for Lenny Melnick for including me in it. I'll let you know when I'm coming. It's going to be probably on a Tuesday. My main man Arnie is going to be with me. So we're going to have a co-show, I think, in the very near future. It's been too long. I don't know if we're going to talk football, baseball, basketball. Who the hell knows, you know? But for anyway, don't eat too much turkey, guys. Take a moment. Be appreciative to be around the ones you love. And enjoy some good sports. So, till next time, Chaps Fantasy Chat. Love you guys. Have a good evening.